The lie tasted like honey and ash. For 10 years she had swallowed it, the sweet hope of belonging and the bitter truth of her existence. The weight of the stoneware pitcher was a familiar burden, its cool ceramic a stark contrast to the nervous heat flushing her cheeks as she moved through the smoky din of the great hall. Her gaze was a shield, fixed on the worn floorboards. Don't spill, don't stumble, don't meet their eyes. It was a prayer, a mantra, the only thing that kept the shaking in her hands at bay. In fact, her entire life had been a lesson in unobtrusiveness. She was Evelyn, the orphaned Omega, a ghost who served tables and mended tunics, a whisper in the boisterous song of the Black Moon Pack. And today was the day the ghost was supposed to become a woman, the choosing ceremony. Her fated mate, Cain, the pack's soon-to-be beta, would claim her, and the pitying glances would finally stop. She's a diligent little thing, I'll give her that. The voice belonged to Lyra, sharp and coded in condescension. Cain is so noble, willing to lift up an orphaned Omega like her. He'll finally make her respectable. The words were a public performance, designed to be overheard. They landed like small, sharp stones against Evelyn's skin, and a hot flush of shame crept up her neck. She didn't dare react. Her grip just tightened on the pitcher for a brief, searing second before she forced her fingers to relax. Respectable. As if she were a stray dog being granted a collar. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was her reality, a thing to be pitied, a project for a noble mate to undertake. And she hated it. Oh, how she hated it with a fire that she had to smother every single day. From there, she finished her task, her movements fluid and silent, a dance of practiced invisibility. As she turned to retreat to the kitchens, her sanctuary of steam and anonymity, she saw him. Cain. He stood near the great hearth, broad-shouldered and confident, his laughter ringing out as he spoke with two of his warriors. He was everything she was not, admired, certain, his place in the world as solid as the stone walls around them. As if pulled by a string, his head turned. His eyes, cool and gray as a winter storm, met hers across the crowded hall. In that moment, the world dissolved. The clatter of goblets, the boasting, the crackle of the fire, it all faded into a distant hum. This man held her entire future in his hands. He could erase the word orphan from her identity and replace it with mate. He could give her a life, not just an existence. The moment their eyes locked, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he gave her a quick, almost imperceptible nod. It was nothing. A twitch of a muscle. To Evelyn, it was everything. It was a promise, a confirmation, a secret shared in a crowded room. I see you. I choose you. We are still one. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips in a silent, relieved sigh, and the fragile, fluttering warmth that filled her chest felt dangerously like hope. Because of that, her step was a fraction lighter as she turned back toward the kitchens. The weight of the pitcher no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a countdown. Just a few more hours. Then, everything would change. But before the ceremony, she needed a moment. A single breath where no one was looking at her, judging her, or pitying her. She found it in the quiet of the scullery, the air cool and damp with the scent of soap and stone. Her reflection in a basin of still water was a stranger's, a pale, serious girl with eyes too big for her face, a smudge of flour on her cheek, an Omega. Small, unthreatening. It was another lie. Without warning, a flash of rebellious heat surged through her veins, a phantom wolf clawing at the inside of her ribs. It was a wild, ancient power she had spent her life suppressing. Her heart hammered against her chest, a frantic, terrified drumbeat. Stop it. Hide it. Be small. The power was a stain on her soul, a secret so dangerous that its discovery would mean exile, or death. She still remembered the whispers after her parents' death in the rogue attack. She'd been just a child, hiding in a root cellar, listening to the elders talk. Tainted blood, one had murmured. Her mother's line, it was always wrong. unnatural. They didn't know she could hear, but she heard, and she had understood. Her very nature was a crime. No matter how hard she tried, the feeling of that monstrous, hidden part of her was always there, lurking beneath her skin. A growl she had to swallow, a strength she had to hide, an alpha spark in an omega's body. Maybe it was fate that Cain, a steady and respectable beta, was her mate. He would ground her. He would keep her safe from herself. She had to believe in him, because the alternative was a loneliness so complete it felt like an abyss. Her hands trembled as she splashed the cold water on her face, the shock of it a welcome distraction. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the inner wolf back into its cage. Thump, thump, thump. The ceremonial drums began to beat, a low, resonant call that vibrated through the stone floor and up into her bones. Time was up. Her fate was waiting in the moonlit courtyard.
King Raiden arrived on a wave of silence. One moment, the courtyard of the Black Moon Pack was a cacophony of nervous chatter and boastful posturing. The next, a hush fell as he and his royal guard stepped through the ancient gate. The local alpha, a stout, balding wolf named Alaric, scurried forward, his head bowed in a display of fawning deference that Raiden found utterly contemptible. "Your Majesty," Alaric stammered, his scent thick with anxiety. "We are honored, deeply honored by your presence at our humble ceremony." "So you've said." Raiden's voice was low, bored. His gaze, the color of molten gold, swept over the assembled pack. He saw weakness. He saw complacency. He saw a pack rotting from the inside with outdated traditions and a pathetic attachment to propriety. He was here because duty demanded it, because these smaller packs still fell under his rule, but truth be told, he'd rather be on the battlefield. At least there the threats were honest. More importantly, he was a king ruling a kingdom that was fraying at the edges. Rival packs to the north grew bolder, challenging his authority, testing his borders. He needed warriors. He needed strength. What he found here was disappointing. They were so obsessed with their pure bloodlines and fated pairings they couldn't see the rot in their own foundations. And then he smelled it. It was a flicker. Nothing more. A wrong note in a familiar, dreary song. Beneath the common sense of wolf pine and nervous sweat, there was something else. The sharp electric tang of ozone after a lightning strike. The raw, untamed scent of pure, undiluted alpha power. Here, impossible. He knew every alpha of rank in this territory. It vanished as quickly as it came, and he dismissed it. A trick of the wind. A scent carried from his own guards. "The moon is high, Alaric," Raiden said, his voice cutting through the alpha's continued fawning. "Let's get on with this." Alaric flinched but obeyed, scrambling to the ceremonial dais. Raiden took his place on the elevated throne set for him, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. He let his gaze drift over the she-wolves, the omegas, all waiting with trembling hope to be claimed. So much hope placed in the hands of others. It was a weakness he could not afford to understand. His duty was to his kingdom, his people, his future, not to the romantic nonsense of fated mates. He needed a queen, yes, a political necessity, but she would be a queen of his choosing, a she-wolf of immense power, from a strategic bloodline, a partner to help him secure his reign for centuries to come, a weapon in the shape of a woman. But then, as the drums reached a crescendo, and the first name was called, that scent returned. Fainter this time, but unmistakable, and it was coming from the crowd of the unclaimed. His eyes narrowed. The game, it seemed, had just become interesting.
The drums beat a rhythm that matched her own heart, a frantic, hopeful tattoo against the silence of the night. Names were called. Fated pairs, flushed with joy, stepped forward to be blessed by the alpha. And with every name that wasn't hers, the knot of anticipation in Evelyn's stomach tightened. And then, the alpha's voice rang out, deep and clear. "Cain of the House of Fenrir." This is it. Her breath caught. The world, which had been a blur of faces and torchlight, narrowed to a single point. To him. He stood, his shoulders thrown back, the moonlight catching the silver threads in his dark hair. He was everything she had ever dreamed of. He began to walk. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird seeking escape. 1 step, 2. He was moving toward the center of the courtyard, toward the unclaimed she-wolves, toward her. But then, he didn't stop. He kept walking, right past her. He moved as if she were a ghost, a trick of the light, his eyes fixed on someone behind her. Without thinking, her head turned, following his path. He stopped before Elodie, a younger Omega, beautiful and vain, her scent cloyingly sweet. He took her hand. The world went silent, a ringing in her ears. Nothing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Alpha Alaric cleared his throat, his confusion a thick scent in the air. Kane, your fated is Evelyn. Kane's voice was cold, carrying across the stunned silence with a chilling finality. He didn't even look at Evelyn. His words were for the crowd, for the king, a public declaration. The fates were mistaken. I reject the bond. He lifted Elodie's hand, a triumphant smirk on his face. I have found a mate worthy of a beta of this pack. Worthy. The word wasn't a knife. It was a blunt stone, shattering her from the inside out. And what followed was worse. A ripple of snickering laughter from Elodie's friends, a wave of hushed pitying whispers from the elders. The world swam back into focus, and Evelyn felt the crushing weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare, seeing every flaw, every crack in her broken soul. In the span of a breath, her dream didn't just die. It was murdered, and its corpse was put on display for the entire world to mock. Deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't about worthiness. It was about her blood. The orphan. The outcast. The girl with the tainted past. And in that moment of absolute desolation, the cage she had built around her heart for a decade shattered. The monster inside her, the phantom wolf she had starved and beaten into submission, awoke with a silent, deafening scream. A wave of raw, untamed power, pure, furious, alpha power, erupted from her, a beacon of her agony. She didn't see it, but she felt it, a wildfire tearing through the frozen landscape of her despair. She didn't know what scared her more, the world that had just abandoned her, or the power that had just awakened inside her.
Ryden watched the pathetic display with a kind of detached contempt. The young beta, Kane, was a fool. A preening, posturing fool who had just publicly dishonored a fated bond for a prettier face. It was the kind of weakness that rotted a pack from its core. A dishonorable beta meant a weak alpha, and a weak alpha meant a liability to the crown. He made a mental note to deal with Alaric later. But then, the girl, the rejected Omega, broke, and the scent hit him. It wasn't a flicker this time, it was a supernova. The air crackled, suddenly charged with a power so immense, so pure, it was like nothing he had ever encountered. It was the scent of a raging storm, of lightning striking ancient stone, of a fire that had been banked for 1,000 years and had suddenly violently roared back to life. It was alpha, not just alpha, prime alpha, power that hadn't been seen in generations. And it was coming from her. From the small, broken girl in the center of the courtyard. His mind, usually a calm sea of strategy, became a raging vortex, a female alpha, not a myth, real, hidden as an omega, unclaimed. Her power suppressed for years, only to be unleashed by the agony of betrayal. The political implications struck him like a physical blow. His rivals in the north were gathering, united by their hatred for his progressive rule. They called him a tyrant for trying to drag them from their barbaric traditions. But a queen with this kind of power, a power spoken of only in legends, she wouldn't just be a queen. She would be a symbol, a goddess, a weapon that could bring the entire continent to its knees, or unite it under a single unshakable throne. This wasn't a problem. This was a gift from the fates themselves. This changes everything. He had come here seeking strength and found only weakness. Yet in the ashes of this girl's humiliation, he had found the ultimate power. His search for a queen was over. He had been looking for a she-wolf from a powerful bloodline, but he had found something better. He had found the source of a new bloodline. Without another thought, his decision was made. Absolute. Final. He rose from his throne. A low, possessive growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure authority that cut through the whispers and laughter, silencing the entire courtyard in a single terrified heartbeat. And he began to descend from the dais.
From the depths of her despair, a new sound pulled her back. A growl, so deep, so powerful, it vibrated through the soles of her feet and up her spine, a primal command that demanded silence. The whispers died, the laughter choked, and every head turned. King Raiden was on his feet, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that felt hotter than the ceremonial fire. He moved with a liquid, predatory grace, descending the steps of the dais, and the crowd, warriors, elders, alphas, parted before him like a river cleaved by a blade of stone. He was walking toward the center of the courtyard. He was walking toward her. Her mind went blank. Why? What had she done? Had he felt her power? Was he here to pass judgment? To cast her out? To kill her? Terror, cold and sharp, stole the air from her lungs. He stopped directly in front of her. He was a mountain of muscle and authority. His scent, rich earth, ozone, and pure, undiluted dominance, overwhelming her senses. He was so close she could see the flecks of amber in his molten gold eyes. He looked down at her, and the world held its breath. His gaze wasn't filled with pity or disgust. It was intense, possessive. It felt as if he were looking past her skin, past her bones, and straight into the terrified, raging monster in her soul. And he wasn't afraid. Before the words left her lips, before she could beg or apologize or simply fall apart, his voice rang out, a declaration that cracked the foundations of her world. She is not rejected. He paused, his eyes still locked on hers, a silent vow passing between them that she could not comprehend. She is mine! The word echoed, a sonic boom in the stunned silence. Mine. It made no sense. He was the king. She was nothing. A broken toy. Without another word, he shrugged off his own ceremonial cloak, a heavy mantle of midnight black wolf fur embroidered with the silver sigil of the royal pack, and draped it over her shaking shoulders. It was impossibly warm, heavy with his scent, a shield against the 100 pairs of staring eyes. A claim. A brand. Kane's face was a mask of utter, horrified disbelief. Elodie looked as if she'd been slapped. Alpha Alaric was sputtering, his face pale with panic. But Evelyn saw none of it. All she could see was the king. He placed a hand on her back, a touch that was both a comfort and a command, and began to lead her away. Away from the center of the courtyard. Away from the whispers. Away from the shattered remnants of her old life. And as he guided her through the terrified, parting crowd and toward the gate, toward a future she could not possibly imagine, she didn't know if she had been saved or condemned. The journey had been a blur, a terrifying, silent passage in a grand carriage that felt more like a cage on wheels. He sat across from her, a king carved from shadow and amber, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the carriage. Not a single word was spoken, and when they arrived, the fortress was a nightmare of stone and shadow, a black dagger aimed at the heart of the moon. But then, they led her inside. The chamber he brought her to wasn't a dungeon. It was a paradise. A fire roared in a marble hearth the size of a wagon. Silken tapestries depicting ancient hunts and star-dusted forests covered the walls, their threads shimmering in the firelight. The bed was a mountain of furs and velvet, so vast she could have slept in it for a week without touching the same spot twice. In fact, it was the most beautiful room she had ever seen, and she had never felt more like a prisoner. Moments later, A young she-wolf, her eyes wide with a terror that bordered on reverence, entered with a tray of food and a pitcher of steaming water. She wouldn't look at Evelyn. Not directly. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her hands trembling so badly that the goblet on her tray rattled a frantic rhythm. "My name is Lyra, my lady," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Evelyn's own voice felt rusty, raw from disuse. "Please. You don't have to—" "The king commanded we see to your every comfort," the girl blurted out, finally daring a terrified glance before her eyes snapped back to the floor. She set the tray down with a clatter and practically ran from the room. The space between them burned with the girl's fear. And Evelyn understood. She wasn't a guest. She was a curiosity, a monster, the king's strange new pet. The silence that followed was a crushing weight, and she sank onto the edge of the massive bed, the king's heavy fur cloak still wrapped around her like a brand. It smelled of him, of power, of the wild, of a storm she knew, deep down. She was now trapped inside. What did he want? A prisoner? A prize? A weapon? She didn't know what scared her more. The not knowing, or the terrifying suspicion that he had looked at her and seen the one thing she had spent her entire life trying to hide. That night, sleep was a stranger. She was haunted by golden eyes and a voice that had claimed her before the world. Come morning, her unease had solidified into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't a terrified servant. It was a woman, older, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at her sharp, intelligent face. Her scent was crisp, like winter frost, and her eyes missed nothing. "I am Kaelin," the woman said, her voice devoid of warmth. "The king has instructed me to begin your education." Evelyn stood, her heart beginning to pound. "Education? You are to be the king's consort," Kaelin stated, as if discussing the weather. "As such, you must learn our history, our politics, our etiquette. You must learn how to stand, how to speak, how to be in the presence of power." Her eyes raked over Evelyn, a dismissive glance that catalogued every frayed edge of her spirit. "We have much work to do." Before she could move, before she could find her voice to protest, Kaelin had already begun, her sharp instructions filling the opulent cage with the rules of a life Evelyn had never asked for.
From his seat at the head of the great table, Ryden watched her. The formal dinner was his chosen arena, a test. He had given her a new gown of deep emerald silk, had Kaelin instruct her on which of the dozen silver utensils to use. And now, he watched as she sat, a small, still flame in the boisterous, dangerous world of his court. She was trying so hard to be invisible, her eyes fixed on her plate, her posture rigid with a fear he could smell from across the hall, a sharp, metallic tang under the scent of her own unique, wild magic. He needed to see what he had claimed. Was she just raw, untamed power? Or was there steel beneath the fear? His gamble had been immense, a shocking move that had sent ripples of outrage and opportunity through the rival packs. He had to know if the asset he'd acquired could be honed, or if she would shatter. His eyes swept the table, landing on Lord Vorlag. Perfect. Vorlag was an arrogant, traditionalist brute whose bloodline was old but whose mind was small. He hated Ryden's progressive ideas, and he would see Evelyn as the ultimate symbol of that corruption. As if on cue, Vorlag's voice, a gravelly boom, cut across the table. "A toast," he bellowed, raising his goblet, "to the king's peculiar taste." A ripple of sycophantic laughter followed. "Tell me, my lady," he said, his piggish eyes fixing on Evelyn. "Is it true you were a serving girl? Must be a relief to finally have a full belly without having to scrub the pots for it." The barb was crude, but effective. The air thickened. Every eye turned to Evelyn. Ryden did nothing. He leaned back in his throne-like chair, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled before him. He watched her. He saw the color drain from her face, He saw the subtle tremor in her hand as she set her fork down. He saw her shoulders hunch, the instinct to become small, to disappear, taking over. She was folding, breaking. And something inside him, a dark, possessive, primal thing, snarled. Still, he waited. He gave her a single, silent beat to find her own voice. When she didn't, he moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, cold, and they sliced through the hall like shards of ice. Lord Vorlag. Vorlag started, his smug expression faltering. You forget your place. Ryden continued, his voice a low, dangerous purr. She is my guest, my choice. To insult her is to insult me. He let the words hang in the air, a promise of violence. And I do not suffer insults lightly. Do you understand? The blood drained from Vorlag's face. He scrambled to his feet, bowing low. Forgive me, Your Majesty. A clumsy jest. It will not happen again. No, Ryden agreed softly. It won't. He dismissed the trembling lord with a wave of his hand, and the dinner resumed, though the mood was now thick with a fear that was far more respectful than their earlier mockery. He had made his point. She was his, and he was her only shield. For now, that dependency was a necessary tool. Later that night, he found her staring out a high window, looking at the moon. He will not trouble you again, he said, his voice startling her. She turned, her expression guarded. Because you commanded it. For now, he agreed, stepping closer. The space between them crackled. That is how this world works, but it is a temporary solution. He stopped, standing beside her, his gaze following hers to the moon. Power is not given here, Evelyn. It is not offered freely out of kindness or respect. He turned his head, his golden eyes locking onto hers, pinning her in place. It is taken, he whispered, the word a promise and a challenge. Learn to take it.
Learn to take it. The words haunted her. They echoed in the silent, lonely opulence of her chambers. They followed her through Kaylin's grueling lessons in history and etiquette. They were a riddle she couldn't solve, because how could someone like her, someone whose entire life had been a lesson in yielding, ever learn to take? Desperate for a moment of peace, a moment to breathe air that wasn't thick with tension and the scent of the king's power, she found her way to the royal library. It was a cathedral of knowledge, a vast, silent space that smelled of old paper, leather, and dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the high windows. For the first time since she'd arrived, the knot in her stomach eased. Here she could be small without feeling worthless. She traced the spine of a book, her fingers lingering on the tooled leather. Maybe here she could find... Well, look what crawled out of the kennels. The voice was like honey laced with poison. Evelyn turned. Lady Seraphina, one of the court's most influential and cruelest beauties, stood there, flanked by two of her giggling acolytes. Her gown was the color of blood, her smile just as sharp. I'm surprised the king lets you wander about freely, Seraphina continued, her eyes sweeping over Evelyn's simple dress with disdain. Aren't you afraid you'll get lost? This castle is so very large. It's not like the servants' hovels you're used to. Evelyn's first instinct was to shrink, to apologize, to flee. But then she remembered the humiliation at the dinner. She remembered Lord Vorlag's sneering face, and she remembered the king's words. Learn to take it. I'm managing, Evelyn said, her voice quiet but steady. Seraphina's smile tightened. She took a step closer, invading Evelyn's space, her cloying floral scent a suffocating cloud. You have nothing to say, do you? A little mouse? That's all you are. He'll grow tired of you soon enough. A king needs a queen, not a pet. She reached out, her fingers aiming for Evelyn's cheek in a gesture of mocking condescension. And as her fingers drew near and something inside Evelyn snapped, it wasn't a decision. Her body moved on instinct. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but something else rose to meet it, a white-hot, furious rage. an anger at being touched, at being mocked, at being treated like nothing. She didn't move a muscle. She didn't speak a word. She just looked at Seraphina, and she let a tiny, infinitesimal sliver of the monster out of its cage. A wave of cold, silent command washed over the space between them. It wasn't a shout. It was a stillness, the absolute predatory silence of a wolf before it strikes. The air grew heavy, charged with an authority that had nothing to do with titles or crowns. Seraphina froze. Her hand stopped mid-air. The color drained from her perfectly painted face, her eyes widening in shock and fear. She had felt it. A power that had no right to be there. A dominance that pinned her in place. With a choked gasp, Seraphina stumbled back, her acolytes scrambling away from Evelyn as if she had suddenly burst into flames. Without another word, they turned and fled the library. As the silence roared in the aftermath, Evelyn stood trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. The feeling was terrifying, unsettling, and utterly, intoxicatingly powerful. She had done it. She had taken it. Then a faint sound from the shadowed alcove behind her, the soft rustle of leather. She turned slowly, her blood running cold. King Ryden stepped out of the shadows, an ancient, leather-bound book in his hand. His face was unreadable, a mask of gilded indifference. But his eyes were blazing, burning with a triumphant, possessive fire. And she realized with a jolt of ice and fire that chilled her to the bone. He had been there the whole time. He had seen it all.
The Northern Lords arrived with the scent of cold stone and entitlement clinging to their furs. They were relics, wolves who believed power was a birthright, not a thing to be perpetually won. Their leader, Lord Malachi, was a grizzled alpha with eyes like chips of flint, his face a roadmap of old battles and older prejudices. He represented everything Ryden was trying to drag his kingdom away from. And Ryden knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, they were here because of her. He received them in the throne room, a vast hall of black marble and cold, intimidating grandeur. He sat upon his throne not as a man, but as a symbol, an unmovable mountain of authority. He let them stand before him, soaking in the silence, a subtle reminder of who held the true power in this room. King Ryden, Malachi finally began, his voice a low rumble. We come with concerns. Concerns, Ryden repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You travel 500 miles through the winter passes because of concerns? We believe in tradition, another lord blurted out, his face flushed. In the sanctity of our bloodlines. We hear you have taken a stray, an omega of no lineage, as you're intended. Ryden's gaze remained fixed on Malachi. He was the true threat. The other was just a barking dog. What I have taken, Ryden said, his voice dropping, is what is mine by right. Malachi took a step forward, his scent flaring with challenge. An unnatural bond brings a curse upon the land, Your Majesty. The fates chose her for a beta of her own pack, a bond that was rightfully broken. But for you to claim another's cast-off, it shows a weakness, a desperation. It invites chaos. In fact, that was the entire point. Ryden wanted chaos. Chaos was a fire that could burn away the rot of these ancient, crippling traditions. My kingdom is strong, Lord Malachi, Ryden said, a thin, cold smile touching his lips, strong enough to withstand a little chaos. Malachi's face hardened, the pretense of diplomacy falling away. Then we will be plain. This union is an abomination. The northern pacts will not recognize it. We demand you surrender the Omega aberration to the Council of Alphas for judgment. The demand hung in the air, a declaration of rebellion. This was it, the challenge he had been waiting for. His smile vanished. You demand? He whispered, the single word more threatening than a shout. He leaned forward, his golden eyes blazing, pinning the Northern Lord in place. You come into my hall, you stand on my stone, and you demand? The silence that followed was absolute. You will leave my court, Raiden commanded, his voice a low growl that promised death. Now. As Malachi and his lords retreated, their faces masks of fury and shock, Raiden's mind was already racing. They had forced his hand. They had made a public challenge, and now the entire kingdom would be watching, waiting to see if his new prize was a weakness or a weapon. To make things worse, she was still hiding, still seeing herself as the broken thing they all believed her to be. The time for subtlety was over.
The summons came without warning. A stern-faced guard at her door, his message curt. The king requires your presence, in the training yard. Her blood ran cold. The training yard? The packed earth arena behind the fortress was a place of sweat, blood, and steel. A place for warriors. What could he possibly want with her there? Kaelin met her at the entrance, her expression grim. "Stay on your feet," was all she said before gesturing Evelyn forward. The yard was empty except for him. He stood in the center of the arena, stripped to the waist, his leather breeches and boots dusted with dirt. His bare torso was a landscape of corded muscle and faint, silvery scars. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a predator, and his golden eyes were fixed on her with a frightening, predatory intensity. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A lesson," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth or even the cool command she was used to. This was something else entirely, something terrifying. You have a pretty cage, you eat the finest foods, you wear the finest silks, but you are still afraid. You hide in libraries and flinch at shadows. He began to circle her, slow, deliberate steps like a wolf stalking its prey. "That ends today." Before she could move, he lunged. Not to harm her, but to disorient her. A feint so swift she stumbled back with a cry. "Pathetic," he snarled. An Omega's response. Always yielding, always retreating. He stalked closer, his voice a relentless, brutal assault. "Is that what you are, Evelyn? The little serving girl from a backwater pack? The weak thing whose own mate threw her away like garbage?" Her breath caught. Each word was a targeted blow, aimed at the deepest, most wounded parts of her soul. Why was he doing this? "I am not— Oh, you are nothing but," he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "You hide behind my title, my protection. But what happens when I am not there? What happens when a real threat comes for you? Will you cower? Will you cry? Will you show them the pathetic, worthless Omega you truly are?" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. This was a nightmare. The protector had become the monster. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I will not stop," he bellowed, his face a mask of cold fury. He was right in front of her now, his scent, his heat, his sheer power, a suffocating presence. "The Northern Lords want to put you on trial for being an abomination, and right now, I'm beginning to agree with them. You are weak. You are a liability. You are nothing." And as the last word struck her, something inside her didn't just snap. It exploded. A scream ripped from her throat, a sound torn from the deepest parts of her soul, a sound of pure rage and pain and a decade of suppressed fury. It wasn't just a sound. It was a force. A tangible wave of raw, untamed power erupted from her, a shock wave of golden energy that slammed into the very air. The ground beneath her feet cracked. The weapon racks along the far wall rattled, and a half-dozen swords clattered to the ground. The taste of ozone filled her mouth. And then, silence. A ringing, deafening silence. She stood, panting, her body trembling with the aftershock, staring at the cracked stone spreading like a spider web from her feet. What had she done? She looked up at Raiden. He hadn't moved. He stood amidst the quiet devastation, his expression one of cold, grim satisfaction. "There," he said, his voice calm, but his eyes were blazing with a triumphant fire. "I knew it was in you." He took a slow step toward her, his gaze locking with hers. "I didn't claim an Omega," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive whisper that echoed in the ringing silence. I claimed an alpha. In the quiet that followed, her world tilted on its axis. He knew. He had known all along. And from the shadows of the training yard entrance, a figure stepped out, his face a mask of utter, horrified disbelief. It was Cain. Time stood still. The three of them were frozen, a tableau of revelation and ruin. Raiden, the triumphant king. Evelyn, the monster unmasked. And Cain, her past, staring at her present with the eyes of a man who had just seen a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that was almost comical. As the silence stretched, Raiden broke it, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. It seems we have an audience. Come to beg for scraps, little beta? Cain flinched, but his eyes never left Evelyn. You... He finally managed to whisper, his voice choked. What are you? Before she could answer, before she could even think, he took a stumbling step forward, his expression shifting from horror to a desperate, greedy awe. An alpha. You're an alpha. I never knew. Nobody knew. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a prize he had foolishly discarded. Evelyn, I'm sorry, he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I was a fool. We are fated. You belong with me. We can be the most powerful pair in the pack. The words washed over her, and in their pathetic, pleading tide, something inside her settled. The chaos, the fear, the rage, it all receded, replaced by a sudden, chilling clarity. He wasn't sorry for rejecting her. He was sorry for rejecting her power. He didn't regret breaking her heart. He regretted losing her status. She looked at him, at the man whose approval she had craved for a decade, the man whose acceptance was supposed to be the foundation of her entire life. And she felt nothing. Not anger, not pain, just pity. A beat later, she gave him her answer. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the storm that had just ripped through her. It was the calm that comes after. There's nothing left to say, Cain. Without another word, she turned her back on him. She turned her back on the boy who had defined her past and faced the king who was trying to command her future. The fury she hadn't felt for Cain now rose to meet Raiden. It was a cold, sharp, intelligent anger. He had played her. He had manipulated her. He had used her deepest wounds to pry her open and expose her darkest secret. Her voice trembled, but not with fear, with rage. You knew, she said, the words a low, sharp accusation. The whole time, from the very beginning. His face gave nothing away, but she saw the truth in his unblinking golden eyes. You lied to me. In the quiet that followed, the world was raw. The air in the training yard was thick with the scent of his sweat, the dust she had raised, and the bitter tang of her own fury. Cain was a ghost, already forgotten, a relic of a life that no longer belonged to her. There was only the king, the liar, the manipulator, the one who had seen her truth and used it against her. You lied, she repeated, her voice a low, dangerous thing she didn't recognize. Raiden didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. Instead, he took another step closer, his golden eyes holding hers, his expression one of hard, unflinching honesty. I did, he said, his voice a low rumble. I omitted the truth. I tested you. I pushed you. He gestured to the cracked stone at her feet. And I was right. Do you think I could have shown you that with soft words and pretty silks? The world that is coming for you will not be gentle, Evelyn. It will not be kind. It will be Lord Malachi and 1,000 more just like him who want to see you caged or dead. Her chest ached with the furious, painful truth of his words. He was right, and she hated him for it. What do you want from me? She whispered, the question torn from the deepest part of her. I want nothing, he answered, and the reply shocked her into silence. The choice is yours. You can retreat to your pretty cage, and I will protect you. I will build walls of steel and bodies around you, and you can live out your life as my pampered hidden prize." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Or, you can learn to wield that fire inside you. You can learn to be the queen they will all fear and respect. You can learn to protect yourself." The silence roared between them. He was offering her a choice, a cage of gold, or a sword of her own making. The girl she had been yesterday would have chosen the cage. But that girl was gone, burned away in the fire of her own power. Her chin lifted. "I'll train," she said, her voice clear and cold. "But not for you. Not for your wars or your kingdom." She took a step toward him, closing the distance, forcing him to look down at her. "I'll do it for me." The days that followed were a blur of pain and purpose. Training with Ryden was nothing like Kaylin's lessons in etiquette. It was brutal. It was raw. He taught her how to stand not like a lady, but like a predator. He taught her how to channel her furious, chaotic power into a focused, targeted command. He pushed her until her muscles screamed and her body collapsed, and then he would haul her to her feet and demand she do it again. But something else was happening in the sweat and dust of the training yard. The space between them burned. He would correct her footing, his large, warm hand settling on her waist, and a jolt of pure, liquid fire would shoot through her. He would demonstrate a block, his body pressing against hers, and the scent of him, pine, earth, and the unique, intoxicating scent of the king himself, would fill her lungs and make her thoughts spin. It wasn't a courtship. It was something else, something more primal. A mutual recognition of the power simmering just beneath their skin. He was no longer just her king, her protector, her manipulator. He was her teacher, her partner in this strange, violent dance, and she was beginning to see the man beneath the crown, the profound loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, he handed her a water skin, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but her skin tingled as if she'd been struck by lightning. "You're a fast learner," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're a demanding teacher," she replied, her voice breathless. The moment their eyes locked, the air thickened. The sounds of the fortress faded away. There was only the fading light, the scent of their exertion, and the unspoken thing that arced between them, as real and as dangerous as a drawn blade. He took a half-step closer. His gaze dropped to her lips. Without thinking, her own gaze flickered to his. And in that single heartbeat, the world shifted. But before either could speak, a shout from the ramparts shattered the moment. A guard, his voice high with alarm. Ryden was instantly alert, the predator returning, his body tensing as he turned toward the sound. The moment was gone. But the memory of it, the raw, aching want of it, lingered.
He watched her sleep and knew he was a fool. He had told himself this was strategy, a means to an end. He was forging a weapon, and the intense one-on-one training was the most efficient way to do it. It was a lie. He had seen the way she looked at him in the training yard, the flicker of desire in her eyes that mirrored the fire in his own gut. He craved her with a primal, possessive hunger that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the wolf inside him that screamed one single, irrefutable word every time he looked at her. Mine. To make things worse, his enemies were not idle. Reports from his spies confirmed the northern lords were gathering their forces, using his Omega Queen as their rallying cry for rebellion. They were painting her as a curse, a weakness. He had to prove them wrong, and quickly. He was so lost in thought, standing in the shadows of her chamber, that he almost missed it. A flicker of movement on the balcony, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the stone. His every instinct surged. Before he could move, a figure slipped through the balcony doors, a black-clad wraith with a long, thin blade in his hand, its tip coated in something that gleamed with a sick, oily sheen in the moonlight. An assassin. Here, past the royal guard. Rage, cold and absolute, washed over him. He had failed. He had been so focused on the larger war. He had neglected the snake already in his den. He lunged, a silent blur of motion. But Evelyn was already moving. The assassin's hiss as he lunged for the bed must have woken her. Her eyes flew open. There was no time for a scream, no time for fear. As if fate demanded it, her training took over. She didn't cower. She didn't freeze. She threw herself sideways off the bed, rolling as she hit the floor. And as the assassin's blade sliced through the furs where she had been a second before, she looked at him, and she commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a wave of pure, concentrated will, a silent roar of alpha power that slammed into the assassin. The man froze mid-stride, his body locking up, the blade clattering from his suddenly numb fingers. His eyes were wide with shock, his body paralyzed by a power he could not comprehend. In the second of stunned silence that followed, Ryden was on him. A blur of fury and violence. It was over quickly, but Ryden barely registered the fight. His eyes were on Evelyn. She was on her feet, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with the aftershock of what she had just done. She hadn't just saved herself. She had used her power with precision, with control. As the guards finally burst into the room, alerted by the commotion, Ryden went to her. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't know had fallen. She was trembling, but she met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not a victim, but a survivor, a fighter, a queen. And his promise, when he spoke it, was not a king's decree to his court. It was a mate's vow, spoken into the heart of the night. I will burn their world to ash for this.
The assassination attempt changed everything. The threat was no longer a distant rumor of war. It was a poisoned blade in her bedchamber. It was real, and it was personal. As a result, a new cold resolve settled in her bones. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but now it was overshadowed by a fierce protective anger. They had not just tried to kill her. They had invaded her home. The War Council convened the next day in a room thick with tension and the smell of fear. The lords were restless, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. The attack had shaken them. "This is what comes of it!" one of the older lords, a wolf named Peter, exclaimed, slamming his fist on the great oak table. "The North sees the girl as a blight. They will not stop until she is gone. Is she worth a civil war, Your Majesty? Is this stray worth the lives of our sons?" The insult, stray, barely registered. All Evelyn could feel was the wavering loyalty in the room. They were afraid. They were looking for a way out. And she was the excuse. She saw Ryden draw a breath, his eyes turning to chips of gold, his own power gathering to lash out and command them into submission. But before he could speak, Evelyn stood up. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. The weight of their stares was immense, but for the first time, it didn't make her want to shrink. It fueled her. She met Lord Peter's gaze. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It rang with a clarity and a command she didn't know she possessed. "You ask if I am worth it," she began, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the council. "Last night, the North sent a blade for me in the dark. They did not do it because I am a stray. They did it because they fear me. They fear what my presence beside your king represents. They fear change." She took a step forward, placing her hands on the table. A subtle pulse of her own power, calm and steady, flowed into the room, a silent reassurance, not a threat. "You speak of your sons. I will not hide behind them. I will not be the cause of a war and then cower in a tower while others bleed for me." Her voice rose, filled with a passion and a certainty that came from the very core of her being. "I was born in the shadow of this kingdom. It is the only home I have ever known, and I will fight for it. I will stand with you. I will bleed with you." She looked at each of them, one by one, her gaze unwavering. "I am not a blight, my lord," she finished, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that every wolf in the room could hear. "I am your queen." the tension broke. As if a string had been cut, Lord Peter, his face a mask of awe and shame, slowly sank from his chair to his knees, and one by one the other lords followed until the entire council was kneeling before her. Not because a king had commanded it, but because a queen had earned it. She looked at Ryden. He was still standing, his expression one of stunned, profound awe. And in that moment, she knew. The war wasn't coming anymore. It was here, and she was ready.
The metallic scent of blood was the first sign of his failure. It was a thick, coppery stench that clung to the freezing air of the Shadow Pass, a grim perfume announcing the death of his strategy, the death of his men, the death of his pride. He stood on the ridge, the wind whipping his cloak around him, and surveyed the carnage below. His carnage, his failure. It had been a perfect plan, a brilliant pincer movement designed to trap Lord Malachi's vanguard and cripple his army before it ever reached the Heartlands. He had been so confident, so certain. But then, the trap had snapped shut on him. Without warning, a second army had descended from the hidden ravines to the west, a force that his scouts had sworn wasn't there. They had been outmaneuvered, encircled, slaughtered. He had walked into a slaughterhouse of his own design. How? The question was a burning coal in his gut. How did Malachi know? Only 3 people in the world knew the full details of the Western feint. Himself, his war marshal, and his cousin, Cassian. His own blood, the man who had ridden at his side since they were pups. As if summoned by the thought, Cassian approached, his face a mask of grim sorrow, his armor splattered with the blood of their own pack. "The last of the survivors are accounted for, my king," he said, his voice heavy. "Our losses are catastrophic." Ryden's gaze remained fixed on the valley of death below. He felt nothing. A cold, terrifying emptiness had replaced the fury. He had led them here. He had failed them, his people, his pack. "He knew, Cassian," Ryden said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. "Malachi knew exactly where we would be. He was waiting." He felt his cousin stiffen beside him. A traitor, then. "Only one explanation," Ryden agreed, the words tasting like ash. And in that moment, as his cousin stood beside him feigning grief, Ryden felt the first poisonous sliver of the truth. But he shoved it down. It was impossible, unthinkable. He couldn't face that depth of betrayal. Not yet. Instead, his failure and his fury needed a target. And his mind, in its desperate, wounded state, turned to her. This had all started with her. His gamble, his distraction, his weakness. To make things worse, a runner approached from the rear guard, his face pale. "Your Majesty, Lord Malachi sends a message." Ryden turned, his eyes cold, dead things. "Speak it." The runner swallowed hard. "He says, 'The blight you harbor has cursed your blood. This is only the beginning.'" The words struck Ryden like a physical blow. Blight, curse. They were calling her the source of his failure. And in the dark, twisted wreckage of his pride, a part of him, a hateful, wounded part, almost believed it.
The infirmary was a landscape of hell. It smelled of blood, sweat, and the bitter antiseptic scent of the healing herbs the priestesses burned. Every cot was filled. The stone floor was slick with things she didn't want to name. And the sounds. The low, constant groaning of men in agony was a chorus that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. This was the cost of war, not the glorious charge of warriors, but this. The quiet, ragged breathing of the dying. She moved from cot to cot, her fine silks replaced by a simple linen tunic, her hands stained with blood that was not her own. She tore bandages, offered water, wiped feverish brows. She wasn't a queen here. She was just a pair of hands, and there weren't enough of them. And she listened. She listened because the men, lost in their pain and delirium, they talked. They whispered. They relived the horror. It was a trap. A young warrior, his arm a mangled ruin, groaned to the man beside him. "We never stood a chance." But how did they know? The other man rasped. The western ravines were supposed to be clear. The king's own cousin confirmed it. Evelyn froze, a strip of clean linen clutched in her hand. Cassian. I saw it, the first warrior whispered, his eyes wide with a feverish horror. Just before they hit us, high on the ridge, a banner, Lord Cassian's banner. It dipped twice, a signal. You're mad with fever, his companion muttered. Why would he? But Evelyn was no longer listening. As if the forest watched, the memory of Cassian's voice echoed in her mind. He had come to her days ago, with a smile that never reached his eyes, a friendly warning. Be careful. The king only values weapons he can use. It hadn't been a warning. It had been a threat. A seed of poison planted to make her doubt, to isolate her. He wasn't just a traitor to the kingdom. He was a traitor to her. Her breath caught. The linen fell from her numb fingers. She looked around at the suffering, at the cost of that betrayal, and a cold, terrifying thought took root in her heart. What if he was right? What if Ryden's kindness, his training, his possessiveness? What if it was all just a strategy? The honing of a weapon that had now failed its first test. Was his affection as false as his cousin's loyalty? She didn't know what scared her more, the army at their gates, or the sudden, crumbling foundation of the one thing she had begun to trust. As the silence roared in her own mind, she knew she had to find him. She had to see his face. She had to hear him deny it. She needed him to be the king who had seen her, not the strategist who was just using her. She left the infirmary, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, and went to find her king. She found him in the war room. He was alone, standing before the great map table, a solitary mountain in a sea of defeat. The air was cold, still, and it hummed with a dangerous, suppressed fury she could feel on her skin. Ryden? Her voice trembled, a small, fragile sound in the cavernous room. He turned slowly. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, his golden eyes, were not the warm, molten gold she had come to know. They were the cold, hard gold of ancient, buried treasure. Distant. Empty. It was Cassian, she whispered, the words tumbling out. He was the traitor. I heard the men. He signaled Malachi. She waited for the shock, the outrage, the shared fury that would unite them against this new internal enemy. Instead, he was silent. His expression didn't change. He already knew. And he hadn't told her. The cold stone in her chest fractured. You knew, she breathed, the accusation a wisp of sound. Yes, he said, his voice flat, dead. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, a desperate plea for connection, for inclusion, for him to let her into his pain. And then he looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw no comfort there. Only a cold, bitter assessment. This is a war, not a fairy tale, he said, his voice lashing out, each word a cruel, targeted blow. It's a world of traitors and blades in the dark, a world you know nothing about. He took a step toward her, his face a snarl of grief and rage he could no longer contain. I don't have time for your fear, Evelyn. I don't have time for your weakness. I'm not weak, she started, but he cut her off. Aren't you? He snarled. You came to me for comfort? For reassurance? The battle is lost. My men are dead. My own blood betrayed me. And you want me to hold your hand? The injustice of it stole her breath. He was twisting her concern, her partnership, into a demand, a liability. And then came the final, killing blow. He stopped before her, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that shattered the last of her hope. I need the alpha you are supposed to be, not the weak, whimpering omega you were. In the stillness that followed, her world collapsed. It was all a lie. The king only values weapons he can use. Cassian had been right. She wasn't his partner. She wasn't his queen. She was his weapon. A failed weapon, And he was discarding her, just as Cain had done. The circumstances were grander, the cage more gilded, but the truth was exactly the same. She was worthless. Her breath caught in a choked, silent sob. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a hollowing out, a quiet death of the soul. Without another word, she turned, and she walked away. She walked out of the war room, out of the life she had started to believe in, every step taking her further into a cold, empty darkness. As the echo of her soft footsteps faded, Ryden stood alone, the fury draining out of him, replaced by a sudden, sickening, hollow ache. He watched the empty doorway where she had been, the scent of her fear and her heartbreak a suffocating cloud in the air. And he knew. He knew with an absolute, world-shattering certainty that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life.
The silence in the war room was a tomb. His cousin was a traitor, his army was broken, and the woman he had claimed, he had just shattered her with his own foolish, wounded pride. He stood there alone, the scent of her heartbreak a ghost in the cold air. His cruel words echoed in the emptiness, each one a nail hammered into his own coffin. I need the alpha you are supposed to be, not the weak, whimpering omega you were. What a liar, what a fool he was. He sank into his throne, the cold stone offering no comfort, and dropped his head into his hands. The weight of his crown, of his kingdom, of his failure, it was a crushing, physical force. He had spent his entire life building walls around his heart, believing that a king's strength was his invincibility. That emotion was a liability, and in a single brutal moment, his own wounded feelings had made him do the one thing he couldn't afford to do. He had pushed her away. He had lashed out at her because he was terrified. Terrified of his own failure in the past. Terrified of the depth of Cassian's betrayal. And if he was truly honest with himself, he was terrified of losing her. The thought of one of Malachi's blades finding her was a cold, gripping fear that was worse than any battlefield defeat. And so, like a cornered wolf, he had attacked the one thing that had tried to get close. Deep down, he knew the truth. Her strength hadn't failed. His had. As the silence stretched, a decision formed. Not a king's decision, not a strategist's. A man's. He had to go to her. He had to tear down his own walls piece by piece and show her the truth of the wreckage inside. He had to beg. He rose from the throne, his movements stiff, his heart a cold, heavy stone. He walked through the silent fortress, his guards bowing as he passed, their faces etched with the gloom of defeat. But he wasn't thinking of them. He was thinking of her. He found her chamber door unguarded. He pushed it open softly. She was there. Not crying, which would have been easier to face. She was sitting on the edge of the enormous bed, still and silent, wrapped in the simple linen tunic from the infirmary. She was staring out at the moon, but her eyes were seeing nothing. She was a statue carved from heartbreak. His breath caught. He had done this. Evelyn, he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. She didn't turn. He took a step into the room, then another, until he was standing before her. He didn't know the words. Kings were not taught how to apologize, so he spoke the only thing he had left. The truth. I was wrong, he whispered. The words felt foreign, inadequate. He dropped to one knee before her, an act of submission no one had ever seen from him. He took her cold, limp hand in his. What I said, it was a lie. All of it. He looked up at her, letting her see the defeat, the shame, the utter despair in his own eyes. The battle was my failure. Cassian's betrayal is my shame. And I was afraid, I was a coward, I was drowning in it all, and when you came to me, I pulled you under with me. It was the act of a monster, not a king. A single tear tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. I don't need your power, Evelyn, he choked out, his voice cracking. I was a fool to ever think that's what this was about. I need you, your fire, Your heart, your courage. Without it, he couldn't finish. Without it, he was just a king of ashes and dust.
His words washed over her, a tide of impossible truths. She had expected an order, a command, a dismissal. Instead, he gave her a confession. She watched him, this king, this mountain of a man, kneeling before her, his golden eyes swimming with a pain that mirrored her own. She saw the cracks in his armor. She saw the man drowning in the wreckage of his own kingdom. And he wasn't blaming her. He was blaming himself. As he spoke, something inside her, a thing that had been frozen solid with grief, began to thaw. His apology was a balm on a gaping wound. But as the warmth spread through her, a profound, earth-shattering realization bloomed in its place. His apology mattered. It mattered more than he could ever know. But her worth, it couldn't be in his keeping. It couldn't be a crown he placed on her head or a wound he healed with his words. It had to be her own. It had to be a fire lit from within. When he finished, the silence in the room was different. It was no longer empty. It was full of his broken pride and her budding strength. She slowly pulled her hand from his and used it to gently cup his cheek, forcing him to keep looking at her. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it held a new kind of strength, a quiet, unbreakable certainty. "I accept your apology, Raiden." She saw the relief flood his eyes, but she wasn't finished. "But I will not fight for you," she said, and saw the flicker of fear return. "And I will not fight for your kingdom." She took a breath and spoke the truest words of her life. "I will fight for myself. I will fight for the girl who was told she was worthless. I will fight for my right to exist, to be seen, to be the alpha that I am without apology." In that moment, something between them cracked and reformed, forged anew, not in the fire of possession, but in the clear, steady light of respect. "And I will stand beside you while you do it," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she now understood was love. She gave him a small, sad, beautiful smile. "I know." Their bond, which had begun as a king's claim, was now something else entirely. A partnership, an alliance of two wounded souls who had found their strength not in their power, but in their scars. And in that shared strength, a new hope was born. They returned to the war room not as a king and his consort, but as two commanders. The air was no longer one of defeat. It was charged with a quiet, dangerous energy. "Your strategy was sound," Evelyn began, her eyes scanning the great map. "But it was based on logic, on troop movements. Malachi is not a logical man. He is a man of pride and tradition." "He used that pride to rally the North," Raiden agreed, his voice a low growl. "He used you as his symbol of my corruption." "Then let's use that against him," she said, a daring idea sparking in her mind. "Let's give him what he wants." Raiden turned, his brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" "He called me an aberration," she said, her voice steady. "He demanded a trial by the Council of Alphas." She looked up, her eyes blazing with a fierce, brilliant light. "Let's give him a trial by a single alpha. Me." He stared at her, the sheer audacity of her plan sinking in. "A sacred duel," he breathed. "You challenge Malachi himself." "It's an ancient right," she pressed, her excitement growing. "A tradition so old, so sacred, not even he could refuse it without losing the respect of every pack in the North. It turns their greatest weapon, their belief in tradition, against them. It ends the war in a single blow, win or lose." It was insane. It was brilliant. It was a gamble that risked everything on a single throw of the dice. And the dice was her. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the unbreakable strength that had been forged in the hell of the last few days. He saw not a victim, but a queen. His queen. "He will accept," Raiden said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. His pride will demand it. Moments later, they stood before the shaken war council. The lords were pale, defeated, ready to sue for peace. But then Evelyn spoke, her voice ringing through the hall, laying out the plan. She spoke of tradition, of honor, of a single combat to save thousands of lives. And as she finished, Ryden stepped forward to stand beside her, a united front. Lord Malachi challenged the strength of my mate and therefore my reign, he declared, his voice booming with a renewed power that shook the rafters. She will answer his challenge. We will honor the old ways. A stunned silence fell over the council, followed by a slow, rising roar of approval. It was a mad plan, a desperate plan, but it was a warrior's plan. It was a leader's plan. That night, as the challenge was sent by the swiftest rider, they stood on the high battlements, the cold wind whipping around them. The future of the kingdom now rested not on armies or strategies, but on the shoulders of the woman who had once been a rejected Omega. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It wasn't a claim. It was an anchor. And together, they watched the moon rise, waiting for the dawn that would bring either their salvation or their end. The dawn broke, cold and gray, over the frost-kissed field. It was a barren, ugly piece of land, chosen because it belonged to no one, a place of endings and beginnings. Lord Malachi stood opposite her, a bear of a man clad in black iron and wolf pelts. He held a massive, double-bladed axe, its edge hungry for blood. He was bigger, stronger, more experienced. He looked at her and saw an easy victory. A girl. An Omega aberration. He was wrong. She held a simple, single-edged sword, a weapon chosen for speed, not brute force. The cold morning air burned in her lungs. The fear was there, a familiar, icy serpent coiling in her gut. But for the first time in her life, it was not alone. Beneath it, a fire burned, a steady, calm, certain heat. Her own power, her own worth. As if the forest watched, the high priestess, the ancient arbiter of the right, raised a ceremonial horn. The moment she lowered it, the duel would begin. Ryden stood with his royal guard on the ridge, a distant, silent figure. He had offered to be her champion. She had refused. This was her fight, her statement. The horn fell, and Malachi charged. He came at her with a roar, a tidal wave of muscle and fury, his axe scything through the air in an arc meant to cleave her in two. Her body moved on instinct. She didn't meet his force. That was his game, and she would lose it. Instead, she yielded. She used the lessons her Omega life had taught her. How to be small, how to be overlooked, how to anticipate the movements of bigger, angrier things. She sidestepped, the axe whistling past, close enough for her to feel the wind of its passage. "Coward!" he bellowed, turning, his face red with fury. "Fight me!" He lunged again and again, a relentless assault of pure brute strength. And she danced, she moved, she dodged, she used his own momentum against him, letting him exhaust his initial rage against empty air. He was a storm, and she was the reed that bent but did not break. He was getting tired, frustrated, sloppy. She took a hit. The flat of his axe caught her on the shoulder, sending a shock of bone-jarring pain through her. She stumbled, a cry ripped from her throat. He roared in triumph, sensing his victory. But as he raised the axe for the final blow, she looked up at him from the ground. And for a single fleeting second, she let him see it. The fear. The Omega's terror. A trick. A feint. And he fell for it. His eyes lit with cruel victory as he brought the axe down. But she was already moving. She rolled under the clumsy, overconfident swing, coming up inside his guard, too close for him to bring his massive weapon to bear. In the span of a breath, the entire fight changed. Her sword was a blur, not aiming for a kill, but for a submission. A slice across his weapon hand, forcing him to drop the axe with a howl of pain. A sharp, precise strike with the pommel of her sword to the back of his knee, buckling his leg. He fell to the ground with a crash of armor and pride. Before he could recover, she had the tip of her sword at his throat. Silence. The entire world held its breath. She stood over him, not as a raging alpha, but as a calm, collected queen, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her shoulder screaming in agony. "Do you yield?" she asked, her voice clear and steady in the sudden ringing silence. His eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, stared up at her. He had been beaten, not by brute force, but by a strategy he had been too arrogant to see. A beat later, his voice was a ragged whisper. "I yield."
He watched her win, and his world was reborn. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to intervene. When Malachi's axe struck her shoulder, a possessive, furious growl had ripped from his own throat, and his guards had to physically restrain him. To stand here, to trust her, to let her fight her own battle, it was the hardest thing he had ever done. And then he saw her move. He saw the trick, the flash of feigned fear in her eyes, a brilliant, cunning use of the very thing she had been taught to be. He saw Malachi's arrogance and he saw her genius. When her sword was at the Northern Lord's throat, a wave of pride so immense, so powerful, washed over him that it almost brought him to his knees. She hadn't just won a duel. She had validated his entire reign. She had validated him. As the cry of, "She is victorious," went up from his men, he watched her next move with breathless anticipation. She could have killed Malachi. Tradition would have allowed it. He, in his own fury, might have demanded it. Instead, she removed the blade from the defeated Alpha's throat and offered him a hand up. "The war is over," she declared, her voice carrying across the field. "There has been enough bloodshed. Go home. Heal your people. Rule with wisdom." In that moment, she wasn't just a warrior. She was a queen, a true queen, wiser and more merciful than he had ever been. As the Northern Lords, their faces masks of awe and respect, came to collect their humbled leader, Redon descended to the field. He went to her, his heart a thunderous drum in his chest. He reached her just as her legs finally gave out, catching her in his arms. "You did it," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion too vast for words. "We did it," she corrected, her voice weary but strong. A short while later, after her shoulder had been tended to, there was one last piece of business. He gave a silent order, and Cain was brought forward, his face pale, his eyes filled with a terrified awe. He was a ghost from a life that felt 1,000 years old. He dropped to his knees before Evelyn. Ryden stood back, silent. This was not his judgment to pass. Cain stammered, "My queen, I am at your mercy." Evelyn looked down at him, and Ryden saw no anger in her eyes, no hatred, only a quiet, final pity. "There is no mercy to give," she said, her voice soft, "because there is no anger left. Your punishment, Cain, is to live the life you chose. Go back to your pack, be their beta, and live every day knowing what you threw away." She turned her back on him, a final quiet dismissal, and she walked into Ryden's arms.
Weeks later, the great hall of the fortress was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of celebration. It was filled not with whispers and scorn, but with the joyous sounds of a kingdom united, reborn. The black marble was draped in banners of silver and emerald, and the air smelled of wine, roasting meats, and hope. She stood on the high dais beside Ryden, no longer a prisoner in a pretty gown, but a partner in power. As the high priestess spoke the ancient words of the coronation rite, Evelyn's gaze drifted over the sea of faces. She saw the Northern Lords, their expressions ones of fierce, unwavering loyalty. She saw her own royal guard, their pride in her a palpable force. And in the back, nearly lost in the crowd, she saw Cain. He looked small, diminished. He was watching her, not with greed or awe anymore, but with a profound and hollow understanding of his own monumental mistake. A beat later, he simply lowered his eyes and blended back into the crowd, a ghost of her past finally laid to rest. She felt Ryden's hand find hers, his fingers lacing through hers, a warm, solid anchor in the joyous chaos. "Place the crowns," the high priestess commanded. 2 crowns, twin circlets of silver forged to look like intertwined branches of a weirwood tree, were brought forward. One was placed upon Ryden's head, and then the other was gently settled upon her own. It was cool and light. It didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a homecoming. As the cheer of the crowd roared, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the fortress, the world became very still. There was only him. He leaned close, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice a low, intimate whisper meant only for her. "You were never meant to bow, my queen." She turned, her heart so full it ached, and looked into his blazing golden eyes. She saw no king, no strategist, no warrior. She saw her mate, her partner, her home. And as she smiled, a true, radiant smile that came from the very depths of her healed soul, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that her life had not been a fairy tale. It had been a war, and she had won.